I'm here today with my colleague Dae Lee,
Thank you.
and this is Lucas Morgan. Today, we want to talk about some updates in the world of GLP-1 compounding. We're at a time here in the middle of March 2026 where there's been a lot of attention and a lot of excitement in many ways over the last several weeks related to a lot of developments in the GLP-1 compounding space. If we go back to the early part of February 2026, we saw announcements from a couple of different relevant stakeholders in the industry, both at the government sector at the federal level, as well as in the private sector. Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, continuing to be active in that space. And then we also saw some recent announcements and statements from, of course, really important figureheads at the federal level, namely RFK Jr. So just to get started, Dae, can you give us just a little bit of a background? Remind us what we're talking about specifically when we say GLP-1 compounding. What exactly is that?
Yes. So right now we're talking about Wegovy, Mounjaro, Ozempic, those GLP-1s that have been very hot button item in the market. Whether it be Novo product or a Lilly product, there's been a lot of competition coming from the 503A compounding pharmacies as well as 503B outsourcing facilities. And semaglutide and tirzepatide, those products were in fact listed on the FDA shortage list, and then FDA decided to remove it from the shortage list. So as of today, those products cannot be compounded unless they fall under very narrow exceptions determined by the FDA. But also, State Board of Pharmacy Enforcement is also available.
Okay, that was a lot of information, which makes a lot of sense, Dae, given that you're both a pharmacist and an attorney. So I just want to walk that back a little bit and unpack that. So when we talk about Novo Nordisk and we talk about Eli Lilly, they are private corporations that manufacture what we would call commercially available products. Is that right?
Yes, yes. Those are the brand products that they manufacture and sell in the market.
Okay. And when we talk about compounding, forget the GLP-1 piece, but can you just tell us a little bit about how compounding differs from commercially available products?
So, commercially available products are brand name drugs or generic drugs that are approved by the FDA. Compounded products are products that have been compounded by 503A compounding pharmacies, but they lack FDA approval. And it's been like that for, God knows how long, many, many years. And compounding has been with the practice of pharmacy since the birth of practice of pharmacy.
Yeah, one of the things I always like to point out when I'm trying to articulate exactly what compounding means to people is I always look at the logo for many pharmacies. It's the pestle and the mortar. And that I think really illustrates kind of the origins of pharmacy and what compounding really is. So I always envision the pestle and the mortar. Um, you said a couple of other interesting things there. So compounded products are not FDA approved?
Correct, not FDA approved. And it's from the 503A compounding pharmacy perspective, it is based off of individual prescriptions written or authorized by the patient's prescriber that was sent to the compounding pharmacy, and then the compounding pharmacy used different ingredients prescribed by the prescriber, and then tailor that drug regimen for that specific patient. So that is compounding.
Okay. And just to give a little bit of, kind of going back, because the origins of where we find ourselves today in terms of the GLP-1 compounding space, they do go back at this point now quite a few years. Dae had referenced earlier this notion of a shortage list, but just to again reiterate what that means, whenever there's a shortage declared or a shortage list prepared by the FDA, it means that certain drug products that are usually commercially available are no longer readily available, and hence there's a shortage. So under those circumstances, it gives compounding pharmacies the ability to lawfully and legally prepare compounded drug products, essentially in a way to fill in the gap created by this shortage. Dae, do you agree that is that a generally kind of accurate statement?
Yes, exactly.
And so the commercially available GLP-1 products, many of which are manufactured by Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, so on and so forth, were absolutely on a shortage list for quite some time. It was a few years that they were on the shortage list. So then in approximately early to mid 2025, the FDA declares that that shortage is over, correct?
Yes.
And as a result, this really limited significantly the ability of both 503A and 503B pharmacies to compound these products.
Yes, in a way, because after the FDA announced that the shortage was over, certain 503B outsourcing facilities continued to manufacture during the grace period, and then they stopped. And then 503A compounding pharmacy, even today, some of them still still compound those GLP-1s, but those compounded products should fall under a narrow exception allowed by the FDA. But of course, there's also a state board of pharmacy enforcement that, all these 503A compounding pharmacies need to be apprised of before compounding GLP-1s and, dispensing it to the individual patients.
Yeah, and again, just to unpack this stuff at the granular level. So during the shortage, compounding pharmacies are essentially permitted to prepare the product in a way that may resemble the commercially available product. Some often refer to this as essentially a copy versus not essentially a copy. That's language from FDA guidance. Once the shortage is declared over, it doesn't mean that all compounding of these products must cease entirely. But as Dae pointed out, it really starts to limit and put more narrow restrictions on the type of compounding. So a couple of the buzzwords or phrases that we often hear in this context are things like patient-specific need or individualized basis, those types of things. Can you just tell us a little bit more about, from your experience as a pharmacist, but also as an attorney working extensively in this space, a little bit more about what it means to have a patient-specific need?
Yes, a lot of state boards have begun enforcing their authority over compounding pharmacies, and they really look for medical necessity for these compounded products, but also individual needs. Why would a patient really require a compounded version of the GLP-1 rather than the commercially available product? And that is coming from the prescribers, right? Prescribers determine whether a patient needs a commercially available product or would benefit more from the compounded version. And that is the prescriber's clinical discretion and medical judgment. And that's that those decisions are compound to the result of the individualized therapy. So it's more of so compounded products are very individualized, and it should be based off of the patient's medical condition. So that figure is individual product or individual therapy or tailored therapy or customized therapy that is required by not only FDA but also a lot of state boards as we speak.
Yeah, and I know working together, we've seen a lot of different examples of this. I always like to say that sometimes, even though compounding pharmacy can be very complex and sophisticated, sometimes the notion of, patient-specific needs or medical necessity can be for over very basic types of issues. So, for example, common examples are sometimes a commercially available drug product is only available in a tablet form and so therefore must be taken orally. But a lot of times, some patients may have limitations on their ability to take things orally. So, a simple change could be to have the product prepared by a compounding pharmacy in a liquid form where it can be consumed as part of a beverage or put into water, basically. Um, Other examples can be putting something that would normally be ingested into a topical cream. Um, any other examples that come to mind for you?
Yeah, for specifically for GLP-1s, I mean, a lot of some patients, even a lot of patients may experience like grogginess, fatigue, so they can't really process the commercially available product, or all these side effects or adverse events of taking the commercial available product. Then the patients consult with the prescriber, and then prescriber prescribe compounded version of it, adding other ingredients. And that may work very well for that patient. So it's that kind of situation creates individual needs and medical necessity on why patient would benefit more from taking the compounded version rather than the commercially available product.
Yeah, and when we talk about those things like patient-specific need and medical necessity, one of the things that I really like to emphasize is just how important that patient-prescriber relationship is. I think from the pharmacy perspective, it's all about the prescription. Are you working with a valid prescription that comes from an authorized prescriber pursuant to a valid patient-prescriber relationship? So I think that's really important. And what I'll say is, at the enforcement level, the regulatory level, I think that's what you see a lot of regulators really focusing on is the prescription, the patient prescriber relationship. What I have seen, among other patterns, is that regulators are very, very cautious and showing a lot of restraint, and I mean that in a complimentary way, about interfering in the patient prescriber relationship. What they want to do is make sure that pharmacies are only acting pursuant to valid prescriptions that reflect a valid patient prescriber relationship.
Yes, exactly. And then on top of that, I mean, we represented a lot of pharmacies in front of Board of Pharmacy hearings regarding GLP-1s, and we want to make sure that even patients, they understand that wherever they're getting these compounded products from, make sure the pharmacies have the right credentials, whether it be licensing, not only retail pharmacy license, but also sterile compounding permit. And that's really important in this scenario. And from the perspective of pharmacies, not only they have to make sure they have, those licenses in the home state, but also wherever they're serving the patients. If they're shipping the products into different state, they have to have license in those state. And of course, certificate of analysis, that is very important. And, I mean, don't you agree that COA has been a quite, focal point of the FDA investigation and warning letters that has been sent out to not only pharmacies, telemedicine companies, and manufacturers?
Absolutely, Day. And I think, what you're bringing up really brings us to really the next topic on the GLP-1 compounding, which is really breaking down the different types of enforcement and the different levels of enforcement. Now, you've already mentioned several of them or referenced state boards of pharmacy several times. I always like to circle back and just break it down again at the very granular level, the detailed level. We typically, and we being Day and I, we're representing pharmacies throughout the country, we really look at three primary categories of enforcement. One is at the federal level, and usually when we're talking about federal level in this context, we're talking about the FDA, although I will say the FTC also plays a relevant role in certain aspects of this. I would say in some respects more related to marketing and advertising practices, but to be clear, I think the FDA is the leader at the federal level of regulation and enforcement. The next level is at the state government level, and that is really what Dave's been saying all along, boards of pharmacy, your state board of pharmacy. And I can't emphasize enough how critical this is. And I do think the two go hand in hand. You need to understand that compliance at the federal level is critical because if there's any issues at the federal level, there's no reason why a state regulator like a board of pharmacy can't pick that up and also rely on some of the work done by the FDA and vice versa. And the third level is a category that I would call regulation by the private sector. And what I mean by that is really the private corporations that manufacture the commercially available drug products, also pursuing certain types of enforcement actions. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the big ones is private lawsuits. And, have you seen a lot of lawsuits by these companies?
A lot, a lot. Novo and Lilly combined, I mean, countless lawsuits, even pending across the country. And as you know, the most recent one, the biggest one is Novo's lawsuit against Hims, which they voluntarily dismissed after after Hims agreed to sell or prioritize selling the Novo's commercially available product.
Yeah, and that was a very significant development. I would say both the filing of the lawsuit, but also the relatively quick and prompt withdrawal of that lawsuit, which I think clearly reflects that there was a sense of an acceptable resolution to that lawsuit as it relates to Hims and Hers conduct. But yeah, to be clear, lawsuits are a type of regulatory activity in many ways because it's another way of kind of policing the marketplace, so to speak, albeit through the private sector. Um, and the other piece of that I would say is, you know, to be very clear, there's no reason why Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk cannot make referrals to state and federal regulators. And certainly, you should assume that they are because they're also monitoring the marketplace very closely as it relates to their commercially available drug products and will not be shy or hesitant to make referrals or share information with regulatory authorities at the federal and state level.
Right, but from the pharmacy's perspective, just because pharmacies received either cease and desist letters from either Novo or Lilly, or even complaints by one of those company, does not automatically mean that you should stop compounding. As long as the pharmacy is in compliance with applicable federal and state law, you need to. I mean, you can continue compounding those products.
And I couldn't agree more. People should not confuse allegations with being fact. They also should not assume that there's just a wholesale ban on all compounding, including as it relates to GLP-1 products. There is a very clear, well-established framework for being able to compound under these circumstances, and that includes GLP-1s. So to be clear, the name of the game and the big takeaway here is vigilance and compliance with the law, making sure you're doing everything right. Can't emphasize enough how important it is to stay up to date and aware of changes at the various levels. That's really critical. Now, with all of that said, when we let off, I had mentioned, there being a lot of activity and statements, especially coming from different figureheads. So to start that off, it was in the early part of February where we saw the FDA make an announcement where it really seemed like they were going to be stepping up enforcement and coming after compounding pharmacies that were compounding GLP-1s. It looked like there was going to be a lot of attention placed on marketing and advertising practices. And also there was a statement made about attention to the products that were coming into the country to prepare and compound GLP-1 products. Dae, you already alluded to this, I think, when you talk about the COAs or what's called a certificate of analysis. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you've seen and observed since that announcement was made at the beginning of February?
Well, FDA has been sending a lot of warning letters to the telemedicine companies as well as other stakeholders in the GLP-1 compounding space. And they really focus on, illegitimate marketing, right? Making any safety and efficacy statements or not having the correct form of the certificate of analysis confirming that, the APIs are actually coming from FDA approved suppliers. So it is important that all those stakeholders involved in the GLP-1, they need to really watch out for what they're marketing and then making sure that the records are replete with the right documents. I have not seen FDA truly going after a 503 compounding pharmacy, but at the same time, I've seen a lot of state board of pharmacy enforcement activity upon the upon the compounding pharmacies.
And I think that's a really important observation is that we've seen a lot of enforcement against telehealth and telemedicine. So I think that kind of goes back and does support that earlier statement about the notion of really there being a focus on the validity of the patient-prescriber relationship and also marketing and advertising practices, especially at the telehealth, telemedicine level, making sure all of those things are being done in compliance with well-established FDA rules and regulations. Now, if you fast forward a little later into February, towards the end of February, there was a lot of excitement, depending on where you stand in this, perhaps some concern about some statements recently made by RFK Jr., which certainly relates to the GLP-1 space. This had to do with the topic of peptides. Dae, can you tell us a little bit more about what exactly it was that happened with RFK Jr. towards the end of February?
Yeah, I mean, I recall that RFK Jr. was at doing a podcast with Joe Rogan, and during the podcast, RFK Jr. made a statement about lifting the ban on peptides. Currently, I think he was talking about at that time like 17 peptides that were under Category 2, which is do not compound list, and then lifting that ban on those 17 peptide products into Category 1, which can be compounded.
Yeah, and so this was on February 27th, and as you said, it was an appearance by RFK Jr. on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he absolutely was talking about multiple peptides, which, to be clear, there is a demand for throughout the country. It seems that there is a lot of desire and excitement over the potential use of peptides in a lot of different settings. And I think he had mentioned a large number of peptides, but then identified 14 that he thought would be shifted from Category 2 to Category 1. Now, you already briefly alluded to this, but again, just for the listeners to make sure it's clear, can you briefly describe the difference between what it means to be on Category 2 and then shifted to Category 1?
So, peptides in Category 2 cannot be used in a compound. Peptides in Category 1 can be used in compound. It's simple as that. But just because RFK Jr. said, he's thinking about, or the FDA is thinking about lifting the ban on the Category 2 does not mean that it actually happened. It's not the law. So as we sit here today, peptides listed under Category 2 still cannot be used in compounded products.
So what you're saying is an appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast does not carry the force of law.
Correct. Unfortunately.
And so the big takeaway for pharmacies that are considering getting into compounding these peptides, what's your advice as of today?
Well, as an attorney, I cannot condone any illegal activity. So if it's categorized 2, peptides are listed in Category 2, don't compound. Don't use it in your compounded product. But do I know that there are pharmacies out there who are using these Category 2 products in their compound? Yes, I do know. Have I seen any Board of Pharmacy enforcement action on those pharmacies? No.
So I think you make a good point is at the end of the day, it is critical to make sure that there's complete compliance with the law, because to the extent that you make the decision to engage in activity that is established to not be permitted under applicable law, you're really doing so by taking on a high level of risk. It's really a gamble, and you're banking on non-enforcement. To be clear, a lack of enforcement does not mean that the conduct is permissible or in compliance with law. So I think it's just really important to just reiterate that that statement and announcement, until further detail formally from the FDA, does not carry the force of law. And I point that out not in any way that's critical. I point it out because some people misunderstand that. Some people think there's no doubt that RFK Jr. is an important figurehead and is certainly, a high-level government authority right now. But I just want to make sure it's clear for the listeners that that statement does not equal any sort of lawmaking conduct or anything like that. So it's really important to stay apprised of all developments in this space. And until further notice, these products are currently on Category 2 and therefore cannot be compounded. With all of that said, Dae, what do you think just the final 2 or 3 main takeaways are for compounding pharmacies today as it relates to the GLP-1 compounding space?
503A compounding pharmacies should be allowed to continue compound GLP-1 as long as the compounding activity and the prescriptions are valid under applicable laws and regulations. But at the same time, they have to make sure they have the right credentials, right records, buying from the right suppliers, and then not making any safety and efficacy marketing statements in their promotional materials. And compounding has been with the pharmacy since the birth of pharmacy. And I don't think anyone can tell compounding pharmacies not to compound any product or even say that the compounding activity is illegal. And I know there are folks out there who said that compounded products are not legit, not legal, That's not true. Just because FDA does not approve compounded products or drugs does not mean that it's illegal.
Understood. And the last thing I would point out for today is the importance of compliance with all of the various rules and regulations at the federal and state level. And I would just emphasize the State Board of Pharmacy piece because I will say that is where we're seeing the highest level of current enforcement activity.